Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. As you can tell, I still have a little bit of a weakness in my voice, but I'm getting better after a bout with allergies, apparently, that has slowed me down and affected my vocal cords a little bit. There are some, I suppose, who are saying hallelujah. But nevertheless, let's proceed. Today's lesson is from the 21st chapter of John's Gospel, the last chapter in John's Gospel. It contains the passage that is our focal passage for today, verses 15 through 23, often referred to as Jesus restores, restoration, or reinstates Peter. It is one of my favorite, most poignant passages in John's Gospel. That said, let me also say, I regret to see us coming to the end of the study from John's Gospel. It has been most enjoyable. I believe I've gotten more out of this study than ever before, or certainly ever before from John's Gospel. This has been the most in-depth and rich study that I have had the privilege in participating in. And so I hate to see us leave it. Next week we will begin a new series of lessons, this time from the Old Testament. But I digress. Let's look at John's chapter 21. And although our focal passage begins at verse 15, we would be remiss if we did not explore just a tiny bit those first 14 verses. Verse 1 says, "Afterwards Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias," also known as the Sea of Galilee. Jesus had told Mary Magdalene to tell the disciples to go on ahead of him to Galilee, and he would meet them there. This is apparently the fruition of that instruction. John goes on to say that this is the third appearance of Jesus to his apostles after the resurrection. We have previously discussed in our earlier lessons how Jesus had appeared apparently to Peter, to two of the disciples or followers on the road to Emmaus, to over 500 followers or believers at one time. But John says this is the third time that Jesus has appeared to the apostles. Let's also remember that it is along the Sea of Galilee, in Galilee area itself, that Jesus called most of his apostles. Peter, James, and John were in a fishing business together, and others were called from that area. John tells us in the first few verses that Simon Peter, Thomas, and John always says Didymus, the twin, that's Thomas, Nathaniel, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee, were there. And Peter said, "I'm going to go fishing." And they went out fishing all night. But that night they caught nothing, says the end of verse 3. And it's early in the morning. They're apparently coming back to shore, having fished all night and not caught anything. And John writes, "Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. he called out to them, do you have anything, have you, friends, haven't you any fish? And they said, no. And so he says, well, then throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you will find some fish. And so they did, and caught such a huge catch that they couldn't pull the nets into the boats. That apparently caught John's attention, tickled something in his memory banks. And verse 7 says, then the disciple whom Jesus loved. I still want to know when I get to heaven why John referred to himself that way. The disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John, said to Peter, it is the Lord. That's who's on the shore. Apparently, as the early morning mist, it was difficult to distinguish the features, even though he called out to them. But John's memory is tickled, is my expression. And he thinks back to a time when Jesus actually called Peter. Peter, James, and John had been fishing all night, had not caught anything. Jesus told them to throw their nets out again. They said, we've been fishing all night, but did so and caught such a huge catch that the nets began to tear. John must have remembered that and said, and turns to Peter, who would also then remember it. It is the Lord. And Peter, one commentary I read said, John is the quickest thinker, but Peter is the quickest actor. And so Peter, who's taken off out of his outer clothes while they've been fishing, puts them back on, girds them up, which means ties them up around him, and jumps into the water to go to Jesus. And the rest of them pull the boat and the fish, dragging the net with them. It's only 100 yards to shore, says John's Gospel. When they landed, Jesus had prepared a morning fire. He had prepared or had bread and was cooking fish. And Jesus also said, bring some of your fish as well. All kinds of lessons can be made from that. Jesus takes care of us. Jesus prepares for us. He provides for us. But he also calls upon us to provide as well. Bring some of your fish. And he invited them to have breakfast with him. Interesting, I thought it was interesting. In verse 12, John wrote, none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Apparently they knew it was, but they wanted to be sure, but they didn't want to be made fun of or chastised in the sense that they may not have recognized or maybe even doubted who was there. And then verse 14 is where John says, now this is the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now we get to a fabulous passage, verses 15 through 23. The New International Version, which is the version of the Bible or the translation that I read from, has subtitles for different sections. This one says, Jesus reinstates Peter. Most of you may be aware of it. As usual, there is interesting material in and between the lines, and we're going to try to cover some of those and get some of the special meaning that we find in John's Gospel out of these. Let me read 15 through 18. We'll look at those verses before we go a little bit further. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, verse 16, again Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? Peter, let me read verse 17 again. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Let's look at these verses because they are packed full of the reinstatement of Peter to Jesus' service. Remember that at the Last Supper, and let me look at some of my notes and see if I can get there, but I should know this anyway. At the Last Supper, Peter and Jesus, according to Luke's gospel, had this conversation. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. That sets up Jesus asking Peter, do you truly love me? And the first time he asks it, he says, do you love me more than these? So let's pause and ask, what are the these that Jesus is referring to when he asks Peter, do you love me more than these? Some suggest that Jesus is asking Peter, do you love me more than fishing? Do you love me more than these fish? By the way, John reported that there were 153 large fish that had been caught in the net. Some people try to speculate that John was using some special numeric code, but nobody has really been able to explain if that's correct or not. I think the best explanation of the actual number, 153 fish, is John's just given detail, which further proves the validity of all of the things that he's saying. Okay, do you love me more than these fish? Some think Jesus may be saying, do you love me more than everyday life, the business of fishing that you were in before you began to follow me? But most commentaries that I have read and studied believe Jesus is saying, do you love me more than these other disciples? So why would Jesus be asking Peter, do you love me more than these other disciples love me? Well, it's because of that conversation that Jesus had with Peter and Peter's response back in the upper room, because Peter had replied, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death, implying that he loved Jesus more than the others. And Jesus said, before the rooster crows 3 times, you're going to deny me 3 times. You're going to deny that you know me 3 times. And so here he is saying to Peter, do you really love me more than these others love me? You said you did. You bragged about it in front of all of the others. And then you let them down and you let me down. by denying me 3 times. But Peter answers, you know that I love you. Now let's talk about the word love, because John uses in these question and answers different words for love. When Jesus says, do you truly love me? He uses the word agape, which is the special kind of love that's more than emotion. It is a specific choice to value somebody highly, to serve them, to care for them, to be more concerned about them than you are for yourself. It is the kind of love that God exemplifies to us. And Jesus said, Peter, do you agape me? And Peter's reply was, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. But John writes that he said, Phileo, you know that I have a brotherly love and affection for you. Not the same word. Jesus says, feed my lambs. I think when Jesus tells Peter to feed the lambs, generally speaking, the lambs would be symbolic of new believers. Feeding them, it certainly means taking care of them and supplying their needs, but it means giving them the word, teaching them about me, about Jesus, about the gospel. Feed my lambs. And thus, Jesus is saying to Peter, do you love me? Peter says, you know, I love you. I have affection for you. Peter falls short of I agape you. Possibly, and there are many commentaries and with different ideas. I listened to a commentary by Anne Graham Lotz about 20 years ago that has stuck with me on this passage. And she, in essence, and oh, by the way, I have been searching for it the last couple of years. I can't find it. I can't find it online. We used to have it in the church library. I checked it out 2 or 3 times and replayed it. It was on cassette tapes. It was so fabulous, so great, and made the point so strongly. But I can't, it's not in the church library anymore. I fear, I worry that I checked it out and I may not have turned it back in and I have somehow lost it. If so, that's a great sin on my part because it's a fabulous commentary. So I'm going from memory. But essentially, the first time Peter responds, I love you, I phileo, I have affection for you, instead of I agape you. Peter is ashamed because he knows that that he denied knowing Jesus. The rooster crowed the 3rd time right after Peter denied knowing Jesus the 3rd time. The rooster crowed. And when it did, the Gospels say that Jesus turned, it doesn't use this expression, and saw Peter. It says that, but it made eye contact with Peter. And Peter went out and wept bitterly, knowing that instead of going to prison and giving his life for Jesus, as he bragged he would do, he had failed miserably. He had denied knowing his Lord. And so Jesus says, feed my lambs. I think Jesus is saying, if you love me, even, he doesn't say even, if you love me, as you say, then show it. Go minister to new Christians. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? Again, he says, agape. Do you truly agape me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo. I have affection for you. You are a great friend. You are my best friend. I phileo you. I have affection for you. Jesus answered or said, take care of my sheep. Now, sheep are the members of the flock, the adults, the believers who have been around. And so Jesus is again saying to Peter, if you love me, if you even have affection for me, show it by taking care of the believers, those who already exist and those who are going to believe in me and grow through the feeding. Take care of my sheep. Then the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Jesus changed it. John's writing says, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you phileo me? Anne Graham Lotz said in her commentary, and I'm going from memory from 20 years ago, said, in essence, Jesus said, okay, Peter, I'm going to use your word. Do you even have affection for me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? Do you phileo me? Now I'm going to pause there. One commentary written by Dr. Ralph Wilson, whose material I study almost every week, and I greatly respect his thoughts and his interpretations. I differ with Dr. Wilson at this point. Dr. Wilson says he doesn't think there's any real difference at all in the words John writes for agape and phileo, for love, agape, and love, phileo. That John is, there are many examples throughout John's gospel where John says the same thing but uses different words. And Dr. Wilson thinks that's a possibility here. Dr. Wilson is far more learned than me. But the fact that Jesus does it 3 times and John changes Jesus' word the third time makes it, and then followed by John's writing there at the last half of verse 17, Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you phileo me? I agree with Anne Graham Lotz. Oh, by the way, Anne Graham Lotz is the daughter of Billy Graham. I assume most of you know that. She says, she reads this to Jesus saying, Peter, do you even have affection for me? Do you even phileo me? Using the word you have been using. And Peter realizes that he hasn't been able to say, I agape you. He still doesn't, even though he's hurt. He says, Lord, you know all things. You know all things. You know that I love you. Each time Peter said, you know that I love you. This time he says, you know all things. And so he is deferring to Jesus' knowledge each time. But he is still not fully back and fully restored. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Similar to feed my lamb, take care of my sheep, now feed my sheep. That is, teach them the word. Take care of, make sure they're protected, all the things that we need in life, but now feed them. You have a responsibility, and I'm calling on you to do it. Show that you love me. And so we pause for a second. one of the commentaries, Sean Thomas, who writes a Sunday school teacher's blog for Sunday school teachers teaching this material, says that, or asks, maybe is a better way of putting it, have we committed a sin in our life? Of course we have. Have we failed to repent of it and bring it to Jesus and leave it at Jesus' feet, seeking forgiveness? There have been times when we have. I don't know that Sean Thomas is a doctor. He's Pastor Thomas says he thinks Jesus is calling to Peter's attention his failure, his denial of three times, and bringing it to Peter's attention so that Peter addresses it directly with him, and then says, then show it. Show me that you love me. Jesus calls on each of us to do more than just say words, but to show that we love him. Then verses 18 and 19 are interesting words that Jesus says to Peter. And I picture in my mind that, this was right after breakfast. Some of the other disciples, there were 6 of them, including Peter, that Jesus began asking Peter, do you love me? Do you love me more than these? I think he asked that in front of the rest of them because of the way Peter had bragged almost that he was better than the rest of them, more committed than the rest of them. But then I see Jesus sort of putting his arm around Peter as he asks the second and third time, as they walk down the shore just a little bit. And as they're doing that, verse 18, this is Jesus speaking. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Verse 19, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Jesus said, you did what you wanted to do when you were young. But when you are old, you won't be able to. You'll stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Some translations say gird you. The idea is not really that of a feeble old man who is being led around. It is the idea, and that's what John's gospel is talking about when he says that Jesus told him this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. That is, you would be bound, you would be girded or tied, tied up the waistband or belt. You would be tied to a cross and be crucified. John, of course, is writing this long after Peter has died. Peter was crucified in Rome for teaching, preaching Jesus. And when he was about to be crucified, he said, I am not worthy to be crucified like my Lord was. And he asked to be crucified upside down, and that wish was granted. They're walking down the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and we come to verse 20 through 23. Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved, we know that's John, was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? So John is giving further evidence that this is he, the writer himself. And the one whom Jesus loved, he says, don't you remember, we wrote about this at the Last Supper. I leaned forward and asked Jesus, who is going to betray you? After Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me. Verse 21, when Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that the disciple would not die. But Jesus, this is John writing, but Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? What is the lesson to us? Well, first of all, I think it's tremendously interesting that Jesus, in my mind, is walking with his hand around the shoulder of Peter. Peter, do you truly love me? And restoring him and telling him to feed the sheep, feed the lambs. And John is walking along behind, listening. That's how John knows what Jesus said. And Peter, like the rest of us, comparing ourselves, turns and says, what about him? Did you ever tell a child of yours, if you had multiple children, to do something that might be difficult or hard? And he said, but what about brother? What is he going to have to do? Jesus essentially said, never mind what brother is going to have to do. I'm talking to you. You pay attention to what I'm talking to you about. That's a lesson to each of us. We need to be aware of what Jesus is telling us. It doesn't matter if we actually end up suffering and someone else does not. There's all kinds of examples of others who are blessed more than we. There are also those who are not blessed nearly as much as we. Our focus is on Jesus, not on others. Jesus doesn't look at us to compare us to others. He looks at us and says, follow me. And he tells Peter again, you must follow me. He is fully restoring Peter. And then as an aside, John says, all of this created a rumor that I was not going to die. But he didn't say I wasn't going to die, John explains. He just said, if I decide that that's the case, it doesn't matter to you. It's none of your business. You attend to yourself, and you must follow me. Peter did, and was fully restored, and became the first real leader of the church at large, the great church. Do you have that relationship with Jesus so that he can talk to you directly and say, even if you've sinned, I want you. I will restore you. I want you to love me, and I want you to show it. Follow me. Take care of my other sheep. We all have Peter's responsibility, and we all have the privilege that Peter was accorded, that is, to love Jesus and follow him. Well, thank you for joining us in this study of John's Gospel. As I say, it has been most meaningful for me. I hope it has been helpful and meaningful to you. Thank you. Good morning.